cricket world. Now the rules seem coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode, another edition, another conversation, another podcast. Call it what you want, but we are the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, and we're back for the second episode of the West Indies cricket history series. Thank you so much for everybody who listened to episode 1 of the series when we looked at the cricket history in Guyana, and thank you to Basil Butcher Jr. Who came on for that particular episode. We've seen the download figures for that, both on YouTube and the podcast handles, etc. Thank you so much for the support with that episode. And after that episode, Santoki put it to the vote. I think Santoki on Twitter, you said, who do people want next? Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica. You must have then put all the combined islands. I don't know who you put after that. And the overwhelming victor was Trinidad and Tobago. And Santoki, come on. If we're going to do a Trinidad and Tobago cricket history, there's only one person we could get on for that show.
Yeah, there's only one person, Mash, we could get on. We had numerous requests to get this guy on. We've had tough negotiations with his agent, but he's finally agreed to come back on to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, a returning guest. So without further ado, Mashel, do you want to introduce who we've got on today to dive into Trinidad and Tobago cricket history?
Of course, it's none other than renowned broadcaster, journalist. I want to add some other things on, but I think everybody in kind of cricket, in kind of cricket history and current day, present day, past, etc., would first and foremost see this gentleman as a broadcaster and journalist of radio and TV, I should say, of cricket in the Caribbean, but more so from Trinidad and Tobago. And it is, of course, the great Fazeer Mohammed. Fazeer, how are you?
Well, I need to have a word with my agent because clearly they didn't bargain heavily enough to make it even more difficult. But really, it's an honor to be on with you guys in the Caribbean Cricket Podcast.
Thank you so much, Fazeer. And like I said at the top of the show, we're gonna try, like we did with the Guyana episode, we're gonna try and go on a long journey through the kind of annals of cricket history of Trinidad and Tobago. Dare I, Santoki? Dare I kind of poke the beast and say, well, you know, Trinidad, you can't have Guyana without following up with Trinidad. And when we talk about kind of two of the most high-profile territories within the region, certainly you've got to put Trinidad and Tobago up there in terms of some of the key individuals and their impact on the game. But Santoki, we've put together a really good kind of list of people that we need to talk about, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, I guess there's only so much we can do within the space of a podcast to do justice to the history of cricket, rich history of cricket in Trinidad and Tobago, but we're going to try our best to kind of look at the main talking points and the main figures over the last 100 years or so in Trinidad and Tobago cricket. And I think, Fazeer, it'd be wrong not to start with a gentleman born in 1901 who pushed for racial equality in cricket, Learie Constantine. And it also parallels with another gentleman born in 1901, CLR James. And they're two real pivotal figures in the progressive movement, working class movement towards racial equality in cricket. But just sort of your general thoughts and feelings towards Learie Constantine. What did he mean, not only for Trinidadian cricket, but also West Indian cricket and the socialist movement on a whole?
Well, and I think I'm glad and I'm always delighted when there's a genuine intent, and I know you guys are on board with this, to really capture the history and the context of our game. Because so much of our history we overlook. And you mentioned someone like a Learie Constantine. We say Constantine, you might say Constantine, but it's the same person. But Learie Constantine essentially epitomizes what not just Trinidad and Tobago cricket, but what West Indies cricket was about in that early period of the 1920s. In fact, being a member of that first test tour in 1928 to England, he was already past his prime. In fact, his dad, LeBron Constantine, was supposed to be part of the touring team that was in 1906. He wasn't selected. And then people saw him walking around in the capital, Port of Spain, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, I wasn't picked. They didn't have enough money to get me on board." And they raised the money to get him on board, and they caught up with the ship on its way to London. And that's Learie's father we're talking about. So that gives you an idea even from then. The name Constantine, what it meant, not just to Trinidad and Tobago cricket, but to West Indies cricket. And just to broaden it even further, when Learie Constantine became a name in the UK, he became an even bigger name because you're talking about a time before the Second World War, before the mass migration of Caribbean people to the West, to the UK to work. When a black person down any street in the UK was almost like an alien just arrived. It was almost as if you'd hear E.T. go home, those sorts of comments. And yet, Learie Constantine, not just of his cricketing skills, and he was a brilliant cricketer, his numbers don't bear it out. But again, you need to appreciate the context in which he played the game. With flair, with style, he bowled fast. He was one of the great fielders of that era. He hit the ball extremely hard. In fact, many people compare him to a Dwayne Bravo as far as that style and that panache and that flair. But when you're talking about Constantine, it's almost like a precursor to the great Sir Frank Worrell, because when he made his life in England, in Nelson, and played in the Lancashire League, he broke down numerous barriers to the point where he became a member of the House of Lords, a black man, becoming a member of the upper house of the English Parliament. He became a member of Parliament in Trinidad and Tobago. He was a senator. He was a high commissioner for Trinidad and Tobago based in London. So, and also, very importantly, he offered CLR James a roof over his head when he came to the United Kingdom in that hotbed period of the early 1920s, when there was so much talk about Caribbean identity, about a quest for independence. And remember, we're talking about a period that was less than 100 years away from slavery, that was just about 20 years away from indentured labor. So we are talking about a time when it would have been so easy for Learie Constantine just to zip his lip, play his cricket, take the racism that he had to face, get his money because he was a paid professional, and go back home. But he didn't do that. He was prepared to speak out. He fought matters in court. He became a barrister at law. He was prepared to defend his rights as an individual, as a citizen, as a member of the Commonwealth. So when we talk about a Learie Constantine, and that's why I think discussions like this are so important, because it helps our younger generations who sadly know nothing about this through no fault of their own. It's a fault of our education system, that they'll realize that these individuals, men in this case, but women also in different capacities, were giants of their era. And we all stand, the current players, the current politicians, the current individuals of any repute, stand on the shoulders of these great individuals.
Yes, sorry, Santiago, I jumped in there, but do you made reference there, Fazeer, to the kind of link between then and now, and obviously we're going to move on to CLR James, and Santiago will jump back in. But what do you think has led to the breakdown between understanding, as you kind of using that reference point, the figureheads whose shoulders the kind of current generation stand on? What do you highlight as the key moment where that kind of disconnect came between not understanding where we've come from as a cricketing identity?
It would have to be a breakdown in our education system. for whatever reason, whether it's independence, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, independent 1962, same year as Jamaica, a couple other nations got independence a few years later, and so on. But there almost seemed to be an attitude where anything that happened pre-independence is not important to us anymore. Those are the days of the white slave master, colonial master, and so on. Conveniently ignoring the realities that you have individuals from those times who laid the groundwork. And this is the disappointing element to me, that now, even now, in our education system, I could speak for Trinidad and Tobago, significant moments, whether you call them turbulent moments or whatever type of moments, are whitewashed from our history, are removed because they don't fit a particular political narrative, because they don't serve a particular purpose, which I think is a real tragedy, because it prevents us from properly appreciating our history. It prevents us from properly understanding whether they are sportsmen or sportswomen, whether they're political figures, whether they're individuals who fought in World Wars I and II, whether they were just ordinary persons who suddenly faced extraordinary challenges. And we live in a time now where it's almost as if it's not on YouTube, it never happened. And that is the very sad part about it. And I think it's our duty as those who either remember or those who are in positions of authority in the education system. And I'm not just talking cricket or sport or anything, I'm talking about life. I'm talking about West Indian life. And those individuals who for many years previously would have made contributions that helped to uplift Caribbean people in many different ways. So I think it's an almost complete breakdown of our education system, especially when it comes to the issue of history, because we seem to treat history as something that is ancient and irrelevant. And we all know the saying, if you fail to learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think many of us can point to instances where we keep repeating history every 5 minutes.
If we look a bit more closely at CLR James, obviously he wrote Beyond the Boundary, widely considered one of the greatest pieces of cricket literature ever written. But also, I think the point of Beyond the Boundary is it intrinsically shows that you can't look at cricket without looking at the wider social and cultural context. And a big part of his book is talking about sort of the class structures in cricket in Trinidad and Tobago. So he had a dilemma as to whether to join Shannon Cricket Club, which was the lowest rung of cricket club, or Maple, which was slightly higher on the social hierarchy in Trinidad and Tobago, and generally took people who, you know, were of a lighter skin complexion. And he had a moral dilemma as to what he could join. He couldn't join any other clubs which are more elite. It'd be interesting, Fazeer, before we go into CLR James, in terms of Trinidad and Tobago in the modern day, is cricket accessible to all working classes, or is there still sort of a social structure in terms of like England, where generally you can't make county cricket unless you go to a fee-paying school, for instance? Does some sort of social structure still exist in terms of accessibility within cricket in Trinidad and Tobago?
I suppose there would be just some remnants of it, but I would say without fear of contradiction, that the game itself is available to all. Those barriers that you spoke about, which hopefully we'll get into some detail in a little while, because I think it really makes for some very interesting context to our discussion. Essentially, the divide in Trinidad and Tobago right now, and I think it's existed for quite some time, it's almost a north-south divide, and I'm talking about the island of Trinidad here, because I'm sure those from Tobago who might be following this discussion and listening and might want to comment on the discussion, might want to tell their own story of discrimination when it comes to coming from Tobago and being treated with disregard by the bigger island of Trinidad. So that's an entire story in itself. But there is also the ethnic element, because for many, many years, there were teams that were comprised almost entirely of players of East Indian descent. And then you would have teams comprised almost entirely of players of African descent. Or you would have teams that would be historically white, the white planter class. And for a very long time, it was felt If you weren't a member of the Queen's Park Cricket Club, you would never play for Trinidad and Tobago. If you weren't a part of big clubs in South Trinidad, you would never get a chance to even get a zonal selection to be part of the package. But that all changed when, ironically, a Barbadian by the name of Wes Hall came to Trinidad and Tobago in 1970 to play and to coach. He actually played for Trinidad and Tobago in 70-71 when TNT finally won the Shell Shield title. And he was hired by the local tobacco company and jumped in his little car and drove around to villages that would have been ignored for years and brought forth the talents of the likes of an Inchan Ali and Ranji Nanan and so many others. So it actually took someone from the outside to break that glass window, that glass ceiling, and bring about some of that change, which I think thankfully has almost completely obliterated now.
Fazeer, you mentioned Tobago there, and I had written down to talk about Tobago much later on, but now you've mentioned it, I think I'm just going to jump in very early, because I've noted, and I'm guilty of it myself, I think we're guilty of it on the show sometimes, whenever anybody mentions Trinidad and Tobago, not everyone, but a lot of people just shorten it to Trinidad, and the Tobago is kind of left out, as almost as if, well, you know, Tobago's within Trinidad or something like that. But I'm intrigued, just why do you think, apart from ignorance, why do you think that is that Tobago doesn't get its share of the limelight or kind of seen as Trinidad and Tobago as opposed to Trinidad, if that makes sense?
Well, it just comes down to the same thing that has bedeviled us for all our lives and for generations, that attitude that we've inherited from our colonial masters, that if you were the bigger one, you treat everybody else as second class. And Tobago has felt, quite rightly, based on all the available evidence, as far as development, as far as the economy, as far as everything else, politically and otherwise, Tobago, since being hitched to Trinidad politically more than 100 years ago, has found itself in a situation where it's treated as a second class. There's that saying that Tobago is a ward of Trinidad, which means that they are at the behest of those in Port of Spain, rather than the people in Scarborough, Tobago, being the definers of their own destiny. And that is reflected in sport, because even though arguably the greatest footballer to come out of Trinidad and Tobago, Dwight York, is from Tobago. Kellyanne Batiste, a world champion medalist in sprinting, would have come from Tobago. And so many other outstanding performers would have come from Tobago. You still get that perspective that it's Trinidad. And if you happen to mention Tobago, by the way, it's no big deal because it doesn't really matter. It's sort of like the Antigua-Barbuda situation. It's like the St. Kitts Nevis situation, which was once St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla, which has its own story about smaller islands feeling disrespected and disregarded by the bigger islands. To give you some further context to it, in 1976, in the general election, for the years prior to that, for the 20 years prior to that, the People's National Movement government ruled essentially, and they held the 2 seats in Tobago. In 1976, the 2 seats in Tobago went to another party known as the DAC, the Democratic Action Congress. And it was no secret, people could pretend that it didn't happen. But Tobago had to be punished by the central government for having the temerity to vote for somebody else. And I can call many names for who I felt were never given a fair opportunity at Trinidad level, far less West Indies level. When the Trinidad and Tobago youth team of 1982 dominated, it had the likes of Phil Simmons, David Williams. Many may not remember the late Shervan Prague, who was a left-arm wrist spinner who, but for his tragic death in a car accident in 1982, later that year, would have probably gone on to play for the West Indies. Robin Singh, who just had a distinguished career for India. During that time, that team was captained by a player from Tobago called John Pollard, who nobody ever heard of again. A left-arm wrist spinner by the name of Alston Daniel. A middle-order batsman by the name of Ken Williams, who sadly lost his eye being hit by a bouncer from Winston Benjamin in Antigua. These are players, and I had the privilege of having played at that level and never getting further than that, to recognize that Tobago has almost always been treated as a second-class appendage to Trinidad in many different ways. And that's why it's created a tremendous level of animosity, and I think a lot of that animosity is well-founded.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in Dwight York's autobiography, he said it was harder to go from Tobago to Trinidad to play football, the adjustment, than it was from going from Trinidad to Aston Villa when he played football. Such was the sort of differences he saw. But let's just go back to talking about sort of class in Trinidad in that era of CLR, James. An important figure who we thought would be valid to bring up next, Jeff Stolmeyer. Hope I'm saying his surname right, but he's someone who has recently come back into sort of the limelight in terms of literature. David Woodhouse wrote a really good book on the 1954 England 12 West Indies when Stolmeyer was the captain, and he sort of argues in his book that Stolmeyer, on paper, a wealthy white man in Trinidad, but he wasn't as conservative as that. He sort of bridged the gap between this new sort of multiracial era in West Indies cricket by having Frank Rowell as his vice captain. He was a big fan of George Headley. He got on well with Sonny Ramadin. Sort of, what's your take on Stolmeyer? Is he someone that progressive, or was he someone who sort of preserved the status quo in terms of class and race in Trinidad at the time?
Well, that's an interesting one, because I actually have a copy, not of the book of the 1954 tour that you're talking about, but Stolmeyer did a personal diary of the 1948-49 tour of India. And that was the tour that Frank Worrell should have gone on, but chose not to, because he wasn't satisfied with what was being offered, because he was a paid professional. He was playing Lancashire League cricket at the time. Now, again, it's interesting that you bring in that perspective, because, again, this is where I think when it comes to history, we need to be broad-minded enough to be willing to accept views that we either disagree with or we have a problem with, because that's the only way we learn. It's pointless in this social media age of only scrolling down to things that you like, because we learn nothing from that. It just reinforces what we know or we don't know. And in this situation with Stolmeyer, it was interesting that the person who compiled that diary, because they had to leave out certain elements of it because it would have come across as insensitive, it would have come across as rude, it would have come across as racially insensitive in many ways, which tells me that Stolmeyer would have said things, would have made comments, would have made references that would be unpalatable now. And I don't necessarily condemn somebody for that, because, again, I suppose when you hear something immediately, you're outraged and so on. But you have to place it in its time. You have to place comments in its time, because it's easy to be outraged at something that is said about people of African descent or people of Indian descent or of Europe, whatever. But if you understand that the time that Stolmeyer would have lived in, that Constantine would have lived in, that black people would have been almost considered subhuman. I mean, the United States Constitution referred to a black person as what, 3/8 or 5/8 of a man in certain references, which would be abominable now. But to get to your specific point about Stolmeyer, it's again interesting, because even in the latter period, during that time when we talk about Stolmeyer, he disagreed with George Headley being part of that tour to India in 1948-49. His comments about Headley weren't particularly complimentary. And again, I had the opportunity to interview Jeffrey Stolmeyer, sadly before he was attacked, and many may be aware that he was attacked in his own home in 1989, and sadly was beaten so badly he lost his life after that. But he was the chairman of the Trinidad Guardian newspaper where I worked in my first media job, and I interviewed him in 1987. And again, his perspective was a lot broader then than what I had come to learn, because again, the attitude towards people like Stolmeyer was very, very negative. Because again, you had a situation very famously when, if you recall, the Kerry Packer era, when the players signed up to Kerry Packer. Jeffrey Stolmeyer was the president of the West Indies Cricket Board of Control at the time. And the Mighty Sparrow wrote and sang a famous calypso that made fun of Stolmeyer, that basically presented Stolmeyer saying, well, we are the rulers and the owners of the game, and you will abide with what we say. And essentially, Kerry Packer was offering an outlet and an escape from the colonial master type attitude that was personified by Stolmeyer. And just one other anecdote, if you would allow me. When I was watching a panel discussion sometime in the early 1980s, and Andy Gantom, who famously had just one test match innings and scored 112, and then had to be dropped to accommodate Stolmeyer, who was injured and missed that previous test match, and then never played again for a number of different reasons, not just because of the presence of Stolmeyer. There was a panel discussion which took place, and Gantom was involved, and subsequently the comment was made that Gantom should have been the devil's advocate in that decision. And the person making that comment was a writer by the name of Mike Gibbs, who many people felt was the mouthpiece for Stolmeyer. And Gantom took exception to that in saying that, why should I, the black man in the panel discussion, be the devil's advocate? So to sum it up, you're talking about a time when there was a lot of animosity. There was a lot of ill feeling. There was a lot of discrimination. Yes, there were a lot of people who were forward thinking. There were a lot of people who were willing to give previously underprivileged an opportunity. But let's not pretend that it's all just simply black and white, because everyone would have been in situations where they compromised themselves, even CLR James. And I'm glad you mentioned it, Beyond the Boundary, because I have my own copy. I made sure I did my homework, because I know you fellas not easy when it comes to that. Because even CLR James looked down on people who were at what he considered to be a lower level than him. And even though he said famously, and the comment was in the chapter that is referred to as The Light and the Dark, he said famously, here on the cricket field, if nowhere else, all men in the island are equal. And I think that was the point that CLR James wanted to run right through Beyond the Boundary. That's why he said famously, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? Which essentially means that to really understand cricket, and especially West Indies cricket, you need to understand the societies. Where, for example, as you said correctly, CLR James was dark brown. He had no right being in a club like Maple, which was light brown. And it sounds ludicrous now, but shades of brown mattered at that time in Trinidad and Tobago society. You had clubs like Queen's Park, who were exclusively white, except for the old black businessman who had money but was too old to play. There were clubs like Shannon, which don't exist anymore, which were not only white, but white Catholic. So you had to be a Catholic and a white to be part of Shannon. So again, it brings home the reality of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, just around that period, where everything was not just about color, but shade of color, of religion, of social status, of where you were. And the point I was making about CLR James is that he looked down on a fellow black man who was a keeper, and he just called him by his last name. He never even bothered to learn his first name, because as he said famously, on the social status, on the social rank, so-and-so didn't register. So that was the time of the 20s and the 30s in Trinidad and Tobago.
Listen, Santoki, when I saw Fazeer draw for the book, I knew we were in deep trouble now, you know. but Fazeer, it's interesting that obviously you talk about society and we're setting the context of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. But I'm actually going to pivot to Josh Da Silva making his debut in the last 2 years, maybe 2 years, 3 or 2.5 years, and I'm intrigued to see whether you think that is a thing. I don't want to say in reverse, but just a thing. And let me explain why. When Brendan Nash played for Jamaica and then the West Indies, I always remember Brendan Nash. He was interviewed. I can't remember if it was by like the Jamaica Observer, Gleaner, whoever it might have been. And he'd said when he went over to Jamaica, how difficult it was to feel accepted within Jamaican society. And I think he referenced how if it wasn't for Chris Gale bringing him under his wing, he may not have got the kind of acceptance within Jamaica, and obviously then went on to play for the West Indies. Now, Josh Da Silva is the first white West Indian to play for the West Indies since Brendan Nash, and before Brendan Nash, I'm not sure who before Brendan Nash, to be fair. You may be able to tell me. Outside of the Caribbean, people saw that as an oddity when Josh Da Silva made his debut for the West Indies, as if white people in the Caribbean don't exist. But just from a Trinidad perspective, I guess, is there anything to be said about a white Trinidadian and therefore a white West Indian then playing for the West Indies after so many years and so on and so forth? Or why haven't there been more, I guess I should say?
Let's not beat around the bush either, because you can't pretend that there is reverse discrimination happening in that regard. Because again, Joshua Da Silva, I can reference a number of players because for better or for worse, I was a member of Queen's Park. I still am for some 41 years, a member of the Queen's Park Cricket Club. And there were players who were white, who were outstanding, who just never got a look in. A name that comes to mind immediately to me is someone, again, I'm sure you've never heard of, but it was a left-arm spinner by the name of Chris Gold. And he played for a long time for Queen's Park, won championships, and never really got an opportunity. And there was no real outcry because the general attitude was, well, the white people were ruling all the time, so what if we discriminate against them? That was the attitude. I recall being on a tour to Barbados in 1983, where there was a young white player by the name of Mark Seeley playing for Wanderers, who at one time were an exclusively white club. And to me, to my teenage eyes, he looked a brilliant player. But again, never got a look in. Was that because of reverse racism? Someone, again, when we talk about that 1983 period, I remember a young player from Barbados, his name escapes me now, but his son played for the England under-19 team just last year at the under-19 World Cup.
Jacob Bethel.
Graham Bethel was the outstanding batsman in 1982-83, but we never saw him turn up in the colours of Barbados at senior level. And he eventually migrated to the UK business-wise and life and so on. So again, these are realities that we need to own up to as Caribbean people, as far as whether or not players who were either seen as white or perceived to be white. Because Larry Gomes, for example, you look at Larry Gomes and say, well, there you go, a typical white man. But again, depending on where in the world you go to, he'd be considered mixed race, he'd be considered as colored. They'd say, well, Larry Gomes, he's Portuguese, he ain't white, he's a Portuguese. Which again shows the many different shades and layers of perspectives and opinions that we have, not just in the Caribbean, but throughout the world. So I would say, in answer to your question about Josh Da Silva and why so many people are surprised and why so many people are scared to ask the question as to how come Joshua Da Silva came through the ranks to be part of the team at a time when you hardly see any white players around, it's because we are, for whatever reason, uncomfortable with having that discussion about reverse discrimination, which would have been happening for quite some time.
And just coming in now, we're going to move on to Sonny Ramadin, who obviously made the famous tour of England in 1950 after playing 2 first-class games. Now, Sonny Ramadin, I mean, as the late great Sam Selvon would say, absurdly he'd be titled as an East Indian, West Indian. So Sonny Ramadin was the first to play for West Indies. Sort of in Guyana, Rohan Kanai, Joe Solomon, even Madre, that sort of galvanized the Indian population, particularly in Berbice, about sort of their hopes for the future and how they viewed West Indies cricket. Was it the same in Trinidad and Tobago at the time? Was Sonny Ramadin making the West Indies side a landmark moment for the Indo population in Trinidad?
Well, again, that was a long time before I was born, as grey and as old and as tired looking as I am. But when you research it, when you read about it, it was seismic to have someone of East Indian descent playing for the West Indies. And not just playing for the West Indies, being so successful as it turned out. I mean, that 1950 tour by itself is phenomenal for what West Indies were able to achieve. Test match victory at Lord's, Test series win, all those sorts of things. But again, because we are talking about societies that were polarized on the basis of race, and let's again not pretend that that was not deliberate. This was not accidental. You had people who had experienced slavery, being brutalized, losing their culture, losing their name, losing their history, losing everything. And then you had, following them, people of Indian descent coming primarily from Uttar Pradesh to Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, working in difficult conditions, in horrendous conditions, but at least they were allowed to preserve their culture, their names, their ancestry. That's why I have the name Fazeer Mohammed still. That's why I born and grew up in a Muslim environment. But also, and again, this is where we have to be honest about it, where I grew up in an environment that celebrated when the West Indies lost. Because there was the feeling that the West Indies was exclusive to black people. And the only Indians that got in were token selections and were only picked in Guyana and Trinidad and were dumped thereafter and were never given a fair opportunity. So you're talking about a situation where there was a lot of animosity, hatred almost. And to have Sonny Ramadin, whose name wasn't even Sonny, by the way, but that's another story. But again, there's so much about this gentleman that, I mean, he was given the name KT Ramadin when he went to the UK in 1950. Because, again, the white people said, you can't come here with the initials S. Ramadin. So we're going to give you KT, which means nothing. But if you check the Wisden of 1951, it has KT Ramadin. But because he grew up with no first, they call him Sonny. So again, you have a situation where someone like Sonny Ramadin not only bursts onto the scene as a West Indies cricketer, but is phenomenally successful. He and Al Valentine, the spin twins of the 1950s, being so successful and achieving so much, it meant a huge amount to people of East Indian descent. It didn't break down the barrier significantly, I should point out, because even to today, there are people of East Indian descent who hold fast to the belief that the West Indies is about discrimination against people of Indian descent, even today. And because of that, they will never fully support a West Indies team. But again, Ramadin was definitely a groundbreaker.
Yeah, so before we get onto the topic of Indo-Caribbean sort of identity and in relation to West Indies cricket, just touching on Sonny Ramadin, from what I know of the Fazeer, you'll know a lot more. He went to Canadian mission school and that's where he picked up cricket. But how did he sort of break through? If you had this rigid social structure in Trinidad, as an Indian man in Trinidad, how did he break through to get into not only West Indies, but firstly the Trinidad and Tobago first class team for those 2 matches? What was his sort of path?
Again, it comes down to the white hierarchy, the Queen's Park Cricket Club, hearing about this guy, hearing about this village cricketer who was doing amazing things with the ball, sleeves buttoned down to the wrists and so on. And then they brought him, as we would say, brought him into town to play. and he bamboozled all of the top batsmen, and then he played those couple of trial matches and got his opportunity. So again, plucked out of nowhere. There was no system, there was no structure, there was no proper pathway for a Sunny Ramadin, just as there would have been no proper pathway for players from Tobago, just as there would have been no proper pathway for players from the country of any race in Trinidad and Tobago at that time. But again, it was the sheer mystery of his bowling and the feeling that, look, this guy could make a difference going to England, because again, the way he bowled with the sleeves buttoned down to the wrist, in the modern era, he would be called for chucking, for bowling illegal deliveries, because there would have been that straightening of the arm. And that's why the sleeves were buttoned down to the wrist. He is the precursor to a Sunil Narayan. He is a precursor to Anil Kumble and Ravi Ashwin and the carom ball and all that sort of thing. So when people get excited about something as if it's brand new, it's the same thing about when people get excited about Ronaldo and Messi and forget that there was somebody called Pelé from a long time ago who virtually did all of those things already. It reminds us that what we're seeing now is merely a repetition of history.
Fazeer, you made a mention of, I guess, East Indian origin and maybe not necessarily supporting the West Indies. Well, I don't know if you were present just recently with the India tour earlier, about a few months ago. Trinidad got 3 games. So they got the second test, the third ODI, the first T20. I think the ODI and the T20 are at the Brian Lara Cricket Academy, and the test was at Port of Spain. Now, not so much in the test, but I definitely... Now, Fazeer, I was watching it in London. In fact, I was in Jamaica at the time. Now, unless my TV was deceiving me, Fazeer, I could have sworn that the crowd sounded like they were supporting India more than they were supporting the West Indies. Now, I know that there was quite a lot of Indian fans who would have flown over from the United States for that game, but I don't know, Fazeer, the decibels sounded loud when India were playing well. Now, have I got that wrong? I don't know if you were in attendance, but would you say that there is still some sentiment behind supporting a touring Indian side when they play the West Indies in the region?
Not nearly as much as it used to be, but it's still there. There's no need to be apologetic about it. I was on a flight to Tobago at a time when I think the West Indies were just about to go into a test match. And right across from me in the aisle, there were a couple of young people talking about cricket, and they said, "Oh, you Fazeer Mohammed, what do you think about the match coming up?" And I said, "Well, I think the West Indies are going to struggle." They said, "No, we don't talk about West Indies. We talk about India. We support India." I said, "But you're from Trinidad? And you're from..." "Yes, yeah, but we don't want to hear about West Indies cricket. We want to hear about Kohli and Rohit Sharma and so on." So again, because Brian Lara Stadium is in South Trinidad, and that is where, and again, it's about let's face it, people feel uncomfortable about these things. I don't know why. But in South Trinidad, you would have had the sugarcane plantations, the sugarcane fields, and so on. So quite naturally, that is where you had the predominantly East Indian population base. And for a very long time, they were diehard supporters of India and Pakistan. As I said, in my own household, I grew up believing it was my duty to support India and Pakistan. And I'm not from South Trinidad. I'm from along the east-west corridor in a town called San Juan, 4 miles east of Port of Spain. But again, what you have, I suppose, is not so much a race-based sort of thing as it was for many years, and a feeling of victimization, but because India are the top team now, India are the owners of the global game, and because a lot of people of East Indian descent obviously look like the Indian cricketers of today, they gravitate towards them. I am involved in a little coaching program here in my area of San Juan for a number of years, having taken over from my late father. And the number of students who come through the program with the name Sachin, again, because of Sachin Tendulkar. So it tells you that there is still that very strong connection with India. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it, except when it is on the basis of, well, I don't care for West Indies, or I hate the West Indies because of whatever, the victimization or racism and so on. And therefore, to cut a long story short, based on what you saw, I saw it too, as far as that support for India.
For the record, my younger brother is called Sachin, by the way. And I think that sort of highlights, Fazeer, what you were saying about the complexities of the region and sort of the different structures in terms of slavery and indentured labourship. Indentured labourship having this identity, like the fact you were able to mention Uttar Pradesh as essentially being where most of the indentured labourers come, just having that link to a homeland which was completely disrupted by slavery. If you were of African heritage, you didn't have that link. You don't specifically know where you're from in Africa, whereas indentured labourers, there's always that connection to India and specific regions, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. So I think that strengthens the connection. And I think it's also, but it's like you said, it's also important not to, whilst you understand the recognition for India, not to be anti-West Indies as well, because then that creates the sort of complexities which we've seen. But Mashal, you wanted to move on now to the great Larry Gomez.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting one, Fazeer. So I'm going to throw in. I was originally going to approach this differently, but I'm going to throw 4 players at you. I'm going to try, and I'm going to give you an essay question. And we look, everyone when they talk about the West Indies, like it's almost like you say. So there's almost like a post-independence view of the West Indies and a pre-independence in terms of depending on which particular island we're talking about or nation. But in the champion West Indies side of the mid to late 70s and the 80s, when you go looking for, well, who were the Trinidad and Tobago talent in the champion side? And you may take me to task over this, but I'm going to say it's surprisingly few and far between. You've got Larry Gomes, Derek Murray, who, okay, so he's got 2 World Cup winning titles, but if we're talking, and he was a fantastic wicket keeper. But some may say, well, was he the greatest of wicketkeeper batters? But then that's an era when you didn't necessarily need to be one per se. Gus Logie, and I don't know if Bernard Julian counts. You may include him, I don't know, but I'm going to throw him in there. So I guess Larry Gomes is the standout out of the 4 of them, although you may say Derek Murray because of the 2 World Cup titles. But I guess my wider question is, why was there not more Trinidad and Tobago talent in the champion side, or was it just too hard to break through even if you were good?
Too hard to break through. Basically, to cut a long story short, because when you think about that period in the 1980s where the West Indies lost only 8 test matches, and again, this bears repeating for all of those who go on about India now and Australia and England and baseball and excuse me, and this and that and the other. West Indies in the 1980s, the era of the 1980s, lost 8 test matches in an entire decade. If that is not dominance at an absolute level, I don't know what is. But anyway, to answer your question, Larry Gomes basically was that fulcrum in the West Indies batting lineup of that period. But even he was dropped in the 84 series at home in the Caribbean. He was dropped to the extent where the West Indies went on with Richie Richardson coming into the team to win the series 3-0. And there was no Trinidad and Tobago player in the West Indies team at that time. You mentioned Derek Murray quite correctly. Derek made his test debut as a schoolboy from Queen's Royal College in 1963. He was picked as a schoolboy, set a record with 24 dismissals in those 5 test matches, but didn't play much longer because he focused on his studies and so on, and only came back in the early 1970s. And then he became the regular from just around 1973 until 1980, hence those 2 World Cup triumphs and that famous last wicket partnership with Andy Roberts that beat Pakistan in that 1975 World Cup. And he was a vice captain to Clive Lloyd. And he was also one of the founders of the West Indies Players Association. He was one of the early players who led the charge for player representation. So, yes, he wouldn't come automatically to mind when we think about that great era of 1980. But like so many of the 60s and the 70s and so on, he played a significant role. He was a champion in his own right. But his career came to an end just as that dominating period was about to begin. David Murray took over, and then Murray lost his focus on the game. Jeff Dujon came in, and we all know the story of Jeffrey Dujon as part of that great West Indies team of the 1980s. So Derek Murray is a champion at many different levels. You talk about Bernard Julian. Now, Bernard Julian, if you talk to people in Trinidad and Tobago who remember Bernard Julian in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they talk with a tremendous feeling of loss. That here was someone who was heralded as the next Gary Sobers. And I suppose that was the kiss of death, to even dare to compare him with Gary Sobers, because he scored 100 at Lords in 1973. He was a left-arm swing bowler as well. He scored 84 not out at the start of a test series against England. He seemed to have all the attributes. He played for a long time for Kent in the English County Championship. But he just didn't carry on with his game. He was a part of the Kerry Packer series. But eventually he fell out of favor, because then you had some really outstanding fast bowlers coming on the scene, Holding, Roberts, Croft, Garner, and then so many others after that. But I think his game fell away because he never really worked on his game as much as he should have to become the great all-rounder that he seemed destined to be. And that's why I think there would be a level of disappointment. And obviously, when he went to South Africa as one of the rebels, that was the kiss of death as far as his international career or even his national career at that time. So he was someone who leaves you with that lingering sense of what could have been had he really been able to focus on his game. So I think that's 3 we've covered. Larry Gomes, Derek Murray, Bernard Julian, Gus Logie.
Yeah, Gus Logie.
Gus Logie, I suppose Logie is one of those cricketers where when you look at his numbers, you'd say that it's only because of that great era of the 1980s that he was able to play as long as he played, because his number is averaging 30 odd in test match cricket, the same as Carl Hooper, just about 30 odd.
Yeah.
But again, he was an outstanding fielder. He, as someone who, because of his energy and his enthusiasm, he seemed to become a favorite with the hierarchy of West Indies cricket, because they liked his style of play, his energy, his brilliance in the field, his willingness to fill any role in a West Indies team. And when it comes to the Trinidad and Tobago game, he was also someone, again, because he was from the south, he was from a village called La Brea. Now, La Brea is known famously for the pitch lake, that huge area of natural bitumen. But it's also economically one of the more depressed areas of Trinidad. For someone like Logie, who went to the West Indies youth team first of all, then to the senior national team, then to West Indies ranks, scoring a test 100 against India, getting a man of the match in 1988 at Lords with a couple of 80s and so on. He was someone who you almost got the sense from Gus that he felt that while he might have been highly regarded outside of Trinidad and Tobago, within his own country, because of where he was from, because of his background, he didn't feel that he got the respect that he should have gotten from his own Trinidad and Tobago audience. In fact, there was a famous dressing room bust-up between himself and Brian Lara, playing for Trinidad and Tobago, where on the next day, you had a situation where wherever Logie was as captain, Lara would be at the diametrically opposite side of the field. And again, it brought in those personal dynamics that seemed to work against him. But having said all of that, it was Gus Logie as vice captain who dropped himself when the West Indies were on tour to Australia in 1992-93. He dropped himself to accommodate Keith Arthurton in that West Indies team. And I think he saw the writing on the wall to the point where he announced his retirement a few months later. So I give him immense credit for that, for someone with the level of maturity, because one of the failings we have in the Caribbean, we don't know when to go with many of our players. They're referred to as retired, but if you get the backstory, you realize that they were either persuaded or dropped. And Gus Logie recognized that with someone like Lara on the scene and so many young players coming through the ranks, Jimmy Adams and so on, that his days were numbered, and he had the good grace to step out with dignity, which many even more illustrious names didn't do.
Yeah, most definitely. And obviously we're now going to pivot to the Prince of Port of Spain himself. But prior to doing that, there is one cricketer from the country who I think we've forgotten about as kind of West Indian cricket historians in terms of how good they were. And that's Ian Bishop, right? And sometimes when I think back to my formative years, and once upon a time there was a bowling attack that West Indies could have fielded a bowling attack in the mid-90s. I know Bishop obviously had the back injuries, but they had a bowling attack of Walsh, Ambrose and Bishop. And as much as the side was in decline from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, and then effectively finished after the early 2000s. But prior to that, Bishop had burst onto the scene and looked like and performed like the next great fast bowler out of the region. But I feel like we never talk about him because the injuries cut his career short. How do you see Ian's career?
Well, that's another interesting one, because I feel the reason we don't talk about Ian Bishop is because we hear about him and we see him all the time. It's sort of like Richie Beno being remembered as a great commentator and forgetting the fact that he was an outstanding leg spinner and a better than useful batsman or batter, that he was an outstanding captain, that he was a great cricketer, that he was part of that outstanding 1960-61 series, which I consider to be the greatest Test match series played of all time for many different reasons. But again, because Ian Bishop is now on your television screens, on your phone, on your tablet or wherever, every five minutes talking about West Indies cricket, we sort of push his playing career into the background. And he's very self-deprecating himself. He often makes fun of himself when commentary saying, well, you know, if I were a better bowler, I could have done this. If I were a better batsman, I could have done this. But Ian Bishop, in his prime, before that first back injury in early 1991, was absolutely lethal. If you talk to anyone from that era who played with him or against him, it was not just the fearsome pace, but it was the natural outswinger. Ian Bishop was recognized by the hierarchy of West Indies cricket from, let's say, the late 1980s. The first match I ever covered outside of Trinidad and Tobago was Barbados versus Trinidad and Tobago at Kensington Oval. Trinidad and Tobago were routed for next to nothing. Barbados responded with 400 and plenty for 2 or 3 declared. Gordon Greenidge scored a double 100. Roland Holder scored 100 on debut. Trinidad and Tobago were routed, lost inside 3 days. And at the end of it, being a junior reporter, being scared to approach Joel Garner, the Barbados captain. And I asked him, what he thought about the Trinidad and Tobago team and so on. He said, that guy, Ian Bishop, that you have there, he's a special one. Because even though he He was caned to all parts of Kensington over. They knew, they saw it in him, that this guy has something special. 1988, just a year later, he went on tour to England, didn't play an international match. He went on tour to Australia, didn't play a test match, played a couple of one-day internationals. He only made his test debut after that 1 year's apprenticeship with the West Indies team in 1989. In Guyana, where he went wicketless, was a rain match. His very next match, he picked up a fiver. They recognized that Ian Bishop was something special. And yes, it's a disappointment that his back injuries really worked against him. But even then, when he came back after the first back injury, he had a spell at Perth in 1992-93, that famous series where the West Indies came back from 1-0 down, where Lara scored the 277, and he picked up 6 wickets in the second innings, including administering the first ever pair to Alan Border, that he was as lethal as anyone else. So I understand your point, Marshall, about us not giving Ian Bishop the credit, but I think it's because we see him all the time, we hear him all the time, but Ian Bishop, in his pomp, was second to none when it comes to that ability with a new ball.
Do you know what? Thank you for that, Fazeer. And I'm hopefully for everyone listening to that, they go back and look at some highlights if they can find them of Ian Bishop, because I still will always maintain he deserved to be spoken of in the same light that we speak of Kirtley and Courtney. Granted, he didn't go on to have the long career, but in terms of his ability. Now, Fazeer, obviously we have to talk about Lara, but it almost feels silly to talk about Lara because everyone said everything they have to say about Brian Lara. I don't know if there's anything more that can be added on Lara. So the only question I'll give you, Brian, is I'll give you 2. 1, is he the best to come out of the Caribbean? And you can answer that with some Trinidad and Tobago rose tinted glasses on as well. So is he the best to come out of the region? And 2, what does he mean to the country? Because it's easy to say what he means globally because everyone waxes lyrical about him. But what does he actually mean to the country? So, for example, let me give you this: if Brian Lara decided tomorrow he was going to stand to be Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, do you think he'd win? That's the question I'm going to ask you.
Yes, he would win. And yes, anyone else going up against him would graciously decline to contest. Because Brian Lara is king. He's not just the Prince of Port of Spain. He is king. Because we're talking about the history of Trinidad and Tobago cricket, let me put it in context for you. Think about it through your own lens of West Indies cricket history. Yes, you had your Constantine, your Stolmeyers, your Larry Gomes, your Jeffrey Dujon, your Gus Logie, and so on. But until Brian Charles Lara, Trinidad and Tobago could not boast of a champion batsman. Champion in the sense of someone who defined the game, who when he walked on the field, everyone took notice. Think about it, because we've had quality players. We haven't even mentioned someone like a Charlie Davis, who averaged over 50 in 15 test matches, but gave up the game because he was earning a pittance. But again, someone who could have been great, but just the stars weren't aligned for him at the time. But when you talk about Brian Lara, you're talking about someone who, I mean, for Trinidad and Tobago, he can do no wrong. He can be, as disparaging as it sounds, he could be drunk at the side of a road on a Sunday morning and no one would dare to mention it because it's Brian Lara. Not that he's ever been, but the point I'm trying to make is that this is what might have been 10 years ago, that there was a fundraising match, a FET match, call it that. We call it a FET match in Trinidad, or curry goat match, to give you some context. Played at Queen's Park Oval, and Brian Lara was playing. And the ground was absolutely packed for one reason and one reason only. Brian Charles Lara, Now, I wasn't there because I'm not going to see Brian Lara at 46, 47, and 48 when I saw him at 18, 19, 20, and 21. I don't want to see Brian Lara as he might have been or was. I want to say I saw Brian Lara as he was in his pomp. I don't want to see Brian Lara in his bygone days. That has no interest to me. But again, your question is where is his status? Brian Lara is the closest thing to a demigod in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, to your question as to whether he's the greatest to come out of the Caribbean. No, he's not even in the top two.
Oh, listen, Santoki shut down the podcast.
We're going to get cancelled, man.
He's not even in the top two because, again, I never saw him in his prime. But number one must be Gary Sobers. Must be. I don't know why people have this discussion. Because again, for the vast majority of us, we're relatively young. We wouldn't have seen Sobers. We only see YouTube. Whatever you see on Sobers on YouTube, it's grainy, black and white. You barely make it out and that sort of thing. But you see a lot of Lara and so many of the contemporary players, Kohli and this one and that one and so on. And again, I think Sobers suffers for the fact that he was such a great all-rounder. 235 wickets, 93 catches, captain of a West Indies team, 6 sixes in 1 over, captaining South Australia to the Sheffield Shield title, captaining Nottinghamshire. But he averaged 57 with the bat. He averaged 57. How can you just bypass that? And again, people, he didn't score 10,000 runs. He didn't score 11,000 runs. Well, he didn't play enough matches to score 11,000 runs. If you were to extrapolate his numbers from 93 test matches to Tendulkar's 200 test matches, or Callis's, however, 100 and plenty, or Lara's 125, or Chanderpaul's 150 plus, Sobers' numbers would be way in the distance. It would be in another galaxy. So again, we get excited, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, Lara this, Lara that, Lara the other, fine, no problem. But when you look at the numbers, when you look at Sobers' position, batting at 6 and doing many different things as well, but still averaging 57 in test match cricket, I don't know where the discussion is. And secondly, George Headley. I don't know how people can look past George Headley just simply, he only has 2,000 runs. Again, it speaks to a level of naivety, a level of narrow-mindedness that overlooks the reality that George Headley played test match cricket in that fledgling period, 1930, because he didn't go to England in 1928, 1930 to 1939. He played a couple of test matches subsequently, which he shouldn't have, because again, there was this desperate desire for him to have farewells here and farewells there and so on. But George Headley averaged 60 in test match cricket. And I can hear people saying, well, it wasn't the same then. There wasn't the level of the game then. Well, I would challenge anyone to anywhere, anytime, anyhow, any one of those who might have just switched off the podcast or whatever, to say that if George Headley were given all of the opportunities that modern players have given, all of the science and technology and levels of fitness and whatever else, not VAR, DRS and all the other different things, and so many other toys and whistles and bells and whatever else, and playing on pitches that had to be bone dry before you even turned up on the field, and George Headley then averaged 60. I shudder to think what he would have averaged now. So again, I don't know where this discussion comes from, but certainly, if you're talking about ranking Lara, he doesn't fit in the top 2, which is occupied by Gary Sobers and George Headley.
just quickly, Fazeer, because Santoki's going to finish this off with Ganga and Co. Just about 3-4 months ago, Brian was in London for a film showing that I attended. I was fortunate enough to speak to Brian, and the question I asked him was about modern day West Indies cricket and what would change and so on and so forth. And what was quite instructive is that Brian said that as far as he was concerned, the kind of facilities and infrastructure, he said, had not changed from when he made his debut at 19 to now, almost 30 plus years later. He said, if anything, you could even argue that they've declined even worse than they were than when he made his debut. And the point he was making is, if infrastructure doesn't change, how can you ask anything in West Indies cricket to improve, and so on and so forth? Now, I didn't follow up that question, but if I had the chance to, I would have said to him, so how did you make it through then? Because since Lara, the only other, let's use the word champion, some would take umbrage, but the only other champion batter we've had is probably Shiv in terms of what you call world-class ability. How in your mind, why was Brian able to make it through and make it through so well? Because effectively, apart from Shiv, he's the last to do it.
Simply because he wanted it that badly. I again, because I'm 4 years older than he is, and we grew up at around the same time. I see you wearing Santa Cruz on your sweatshirt because he's from Santa Cruz. So if you're currying favor with the Santa Cruz crowd, you're doing a fantastic job right now, Marshall. But when he came into the Queen's Park setup, we already knew he was something special because he had just been part of the Trinidad and Tobago team that won the West Indies Youth Championship. And I remember seeing from a distance in the area called the Queen's Park Savannah, which is a big area with many different pitches and grounds in it. It used to be fully occupied in those days with 10, 12, 15 matches playing at the same time. Now it hardly is occupied with more than 2 or 3. And I remember walking across to my match, which was second 11. I was never good enough to make a first 11 in Queen's Park. And he was playing with a club called Harvard. And people were saying, come and look at this guy. And he was barely taller than the bat, but he had this high backlift. And you could see just the way he was shaping up and the seriousness with which he played, that this was someone special. Quickly fast forward, in just a couple of years, I played alongside him just for a little while. Because remember, he was shooting forward. I was stagnating in the mediocre ranks. Now, we were playing a team called Defense Force. These are big guys by being Defense Force. And they were all fast bowlers on a matting pitch. And it was like on concrete. And this little guy called Brian Lara scored 87. As if it was the easiest thing in the world. And we were all running for our lives. And you saw something that distinguished him from anyone else in cricket in Trinidad, because we in Trinidad and Tobago, or Trinis, which would again get the people from Tobago vexed because I haven't mentioned Tobago, easygoing, lackadaisical, if Monday falls on a Friday, couldn't be bothered, that sort of thing. But Brian Lara wanted something, and he wanted it badly. He didn't just want to play for the West Indies. He wanted to be a star. He wanted to be a great. He wanted to be a giant. And maybe in some cases that his own ambition got the better of him as far as being a proper leader, which is a different issue, which is something that, again, is an uncomfortable discussion when we talk about Brian Lara, the leader. But make no mistake, it wasn't just the talent, because the talent was exceptional, but it was the desire and the willingness to put in the work, the amount of work that he would put in on his game. It was alien to the Trinidad and Tobago experience.
I hear you completely, Fazeer, and one day we'll have to invite you back to do that Brian Lara, the leader, conversation, because I've always said to Santoki that Brian Lara was not universally loved around the Caribbean for that precise reason. But one day we can have that discussion. But Santoki, Fazeer just made the point about Brian Lara wanting it and wanting to be a star. And when we talk about wanting to be a star, Santolki, there's several T20 stars in Trinidad and Tobago. So let me hand over to you.
Yeah, so for the last segment of the show, if we look towards T20 cricket, it's interesting because the current England white ball analyst, Freddie Wild, he tweeted a year or two ago, Trinidad and Tobago is the spiritual home of T20 cricket. And that's sort of the reputation Trinidad has garnered for itself in the format because of Kieron Pollard, DJ Bravo, Sunil Narayan, three of the greatest of all time in the format so far. We've heard Narayan and Pooran and Bravo talk about the effect of wind ball or softball cricket on sort of developing their skills. But Fazeer, is it as simplistic as saying that's the reason why they've excelled at T20 cricket? Is there more to it, a mentality, a desire issue? What is your logic as to why Trinidad has exceeded all sort of expectations when it comes to producing T20 stars?
I would say yes, that they're absolutely right when it comes to the wind ball cricket thing. We call it wind ball, it's tennis ball. Yeah. That was the spark. There were other things subsequently. I mean, the money, the opportunities. I mean, that in itself has become a momentum shift where people see the opportunity to make their livelihoods playing T20 cricket without necessarily playing for the West Indies anymore. So the paradigm has changed completely. But yes, wind ball cricket is a deadly serious business in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's basically played over a short period, 10 overs, 20 overs, 5 overs. So the fundamentals that you would require in T20 cricket are already ingrained in the average Trinidad and Tobago cricketer, keeping it tight as a bowler, looking for the boundaries, looking for the sharp singles, that sort of thing. So you get the T20 opportunity, and it's just a mushrooming of that same wind ball type mentality. That's where Sunil Narayan developed all his tricks, playing wind ball cricket. So yes, and just as an example, in that short-lived thing known as the Champions League, where Trinidad and Tobago under the captaincy of Darren Ganga went to the final and lost to New South Wales, you looked at that team then with Pollard, Bravo, and Lendl Simmons, and so many others. You saw players who took naturally to the T20 game, and which sadly and conversely meant that they would struggle in other formats, and which partially explains why we are where we are in Test match cricket and why a World Cup is going to be starting very shortly and the West Indies are just observers, which is, again, another discussion, a painful discussion as well. But added to that spark of the wind ball foundation is the fact that this is where the money is. This is where the livelihood is. And for all those who want to label them, not just the Trinis, but everybody else, your Andre Russells, your Chris Gales, your Shimron Hetmeyers, everyone else, who want to label them as mercenaries, I would point you to the period 1977 to 1979, when every outstanding West Indies cricketer of note, with the notable exception of Alvin Kalicharan, went to Kerry Packer for a better quality of life. It's as simple as that. We seem to find it so easy to pillory our players who are seeking better opportunities, at the same time ignoring the fact that here you have England, Mark Wood hesitating on signing a contract, Jason Roy pulling out of his, and they are the best paid players in the world by a long, long way, and yet they are still attracted by the greater revenues of the ICL and the different L's and so on. So yes, wind ball cricket was the spark, the solid foundation, but it mushroomed because of the greater opportunities offered by the franchise format.
And do you think, when I spoke to Nicholas Pooran, he talked about how beneficial T10 cricket is, and we've seen in Trinidad and Tobago, T10 cricket's got sponsored by Fancode in India. It's broadcast on sort of TV. Do you think, in terms of players coming up now through the ranks in Trinidad and Tobago, T20 is essentially the ultimate goal because of those financial reasons and just also because of the pathway they've seen by players from the island?
Well, let me put it to you this way. When I spoke to Evan Lewis in my previous iteration as a cricket commentator on television, I asked him, as his aspirations and so on. And the first team that came out of his mouth was Mumbai Indians. It speaks for itself. Young players these days are excited by the IPL. They're excited by the CPL. The whole curry chicken curry thing and whatever from the CPL final. And I don't know why we get upset as older people, because we haven't done our jobs. We have failed to transmit the history and the legacy of West Indies cricket to youngsters who are obviously gravitating to what they're seeing. So from my own mind, there are still some who want to play for the West Indies. I was chatting with Tony Gray, a name we haven't mentioned, who was a forerunner to Ian Bishop. He was coaching a young man in my own community where he's from, Tony, a young man who aspires to be the next Dwayne Bravo. Because again, there you go. You are looking to mimic the stars you see now. Dwayne Bravo wanted to play a lot more Test cricket, but Darren Sammy was there as captain. There was no place for a second all-rounder in the team, so he didn't get the opportunities. He put his stock in T20, and there you have the results. So again, it's an environment now which moves you more and more towards T20, T10. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a T5 around the corner. There'll be some super over contest of just 6 balls at some point or the other. It may become all meaningless, but once there's money and viewership behind it, you will have players playing it.
What's quite interesting though, Fazeer, is even if we take the T20 cricket into consideration, so let's say we're in 2023, let's say T20 cricket really exploded in 2010, around the Champions League part for Trinidad and Tobago. Even before that, Trinidad and Tobago have won 2 West Indies first-class championships in 40 plus years, right? So even if we go back to Shell Shield cricket and so on and so forth. So Trinidad and Tobago not being very good at first-class cricket, or not being champions, let's say not being champions, precludes T20 cricket. So why do you think when we talk about red ball cricket, it's the Barbados, it's the Guyana, it's the Jamaicas who've all won like 5 in a row or 4 in a row? Why have Trinidad found it so hard? Now it makes sense in terms of modern day era, but in the previous iterations, why did they find it so hard to win first-class championships?
Well, Marshall, that is a reality that many people don't want to own up to. And I'm glad you made the differentiation, because people will automatically blame T20. Excuse me again, I do apologize. People will automatically blame T20. But as you said correctly, and let me make it even more crude. After 1985, when Trinidad and Tobago won the then Shell Shield, defeating Barbados at Queen's Park Oval under the captaincy of Ranjit Anand, you had players like Phil Simmons, David Williams, and so on in the team. No one had heard of a Brian Lara at that time. From that time, 1985, to the present time, what are we talking about? 37, almost 40 seasons of first-class cricket with 1 first-class title. 2006, 1 first-class title. Yet still, you would have had Brian Lara, Ian Bishop, Tony Gray. You can call all the names. All the names. Why is that? Why is it that a country, a twin island republic, that has produced so many outstanding cricketers, your Gus Logis, all the Bravos, your Darren Gangas, and so many others, Lendl Simmons and so on, cannot get it together consistently for a regional first-class season? And I think that word consistently is the key point. And also that desire to play for Trinidad and Tobago. It's another one of those uncomfortable discussions, because you wouldn't imagine that is a discourse in Barbados about playing for Barbados in the Shell Shield, as it was then, or the Red Stripe Cup or President's Cup and different sponsors and so on. But for Trinidad and Tobago, a land which is so sharply divided on race and politics and who's the captain and who's the cricket board president and why is this one being picked and why isn't that one being picked, which goes on even today. It's even worse today at the lower levels. That level of hatred of the other, whoever that other is, whether it be on the basis of race, whether it's on the basis of North versus South, whether it's on the basis of Queen's Park versus whoever else. And people might say that's an exaggeration, but I have lived long enough in Trinidad and Tobago. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have been part of the setup at youth level. I have seen officials deliberately victimize players who they didn't like for different reasons, who merited selection and never got an opportunity. And that sort of environment, you might say, well, international cricketers are above that. Trust me, many of them are not. They carry those animosities. They carry those ill feelings towards each other on the field, even at regional level. And that, to me, is a significant component. Because if you look at it purely on the basis of talent and ability and proven ability in other environments, there's no explanation for Trinidad and Tobago having one first-class title in nearly 40 years.
Yeah, and just I guess pivoting back to, and Santoki will kind of finish this one off. We spoke about the Pollards, the Narines, the Purans, but how much would you say you don't read? How much of that is down to Darren Ganga? Santoki, if you want to kind of carry on from there.
Yeah, I guess we've kind of briefly touched upon Ganga, but him sort of being a captain in that 2009 T20 Champions League, rather than his ability, he was sort of seen as sort of at the forefront of sort of tactical ability in the T20 format, while others weren't doing it. So how much would these players have to credit with Darren Ganga for sort of almost giving a legitimacy to the format and taking it seriously when a lot of players around the world were not?
Well, I think Ganga is an interesting study in the sense that he established himself as an outstanding captain and tactician. And again, because the T20 format came around at that time, he transferred those skills. He's a very analytical person. He's a very thoughtful person. He understands the game, understands the complexities of the game. He understands the complexities of Trinidad and Tobago environment as well, which is also an interesting dynamic. But I don't think it's correct to say that he would have been the catalyst for the likes of a Bravo or a Pollard and those players, because they came up at just around the same time. Bravo came up before Darren Ganga, and Bravo was his own man. He went on tour 2004. He established himself. Ganga had come up in 1998. But when the point I'm trying to make is that when he came as a captain and was able to dictate things and develop his own role as a captain, I think the likes of Pollard and Bravo and others were well on the way already to developing themselves. What Ganga did, and especially that success in the Champions League and the global perspective, was to be able to build off that, to really present Trinidad and Tobago as an environment where you had this groundswell of talent that seemed so naturally attuned towards the T20 game. And he was able to more or less open doors for a lot of players, create opportunities, create pathways, and create avenues beyond his own ability as a cricketer and his own ability as a captain. That's where I think that he did a lot for Trinidad and Tobago cricket, winning a number of titles at that time, including that 2006 title, the first-class title.
So, Fazeer, we've gone on an absolute tour de force of Trinidad and Tobago cricket history, and I was thinking, how do we kind of wrap this? Like, well, how do we bring, like, what's the bookends to this? And Santoki closing it off, notwithstanding, I just quickly I want to bookend it with Nicholas Pooran, because Pooran probably is, I don't even know if this is the right way to put it. Pooran is potentially the last good West Indian batter we're going to see in our lifetime. And obviously, you've got Shai Hope. In fairness, I should say Shai Hope in ODI cricket. But the reason why I say Pooran is in terms of globally recognised as being or having the potential to be a global commodity. Some could say he already is. And in that context, it's important to raise him in the kind of annals of Trinidad and Tobago cricket. But more importantly, where I want to go with this is Pooran had a stint as West Indies captain, and it nearly finished him off. It looked like it destroyed him. Could have just ended up just as well he resigned, because it could have ended up destroying his career, given the poison chalice that captain the West Indies is. But Santoki and I often talk about Pooran is 27 now, I think, and it is likely, Fazeer, that we will never see him play one Test match, not even one, for the West Indies. And I guess, why do you think West Indian selectors won't just pick him? Now, you may have a different stance on it to me, Fazeer, in fairness, because people say, well, Pooran's never made himself available, whereas my take is just pick the guy anyway. Do you think he almost is a kind of microcosm of where West Indies cricket is now at? He's never going to play a Test. He's an outstanding, internationally recognised batter, but that's in spite of the West Indies, not because of the West Indies.
Well, I think that's a question that will probably take another hour and a half to answer properly. But because we don't have that, how should I begin? Kieron Pollard, when he first played for Trinidad and Tobago, forget the Stanford T20 thing, was a first-class batsman of the highest repute. He started with 100 in his first match against Barbados, I believe it was. Got another 100 in his third match against the Leeward Islands. But T20 came around and he was a big hitter. And he was immediately pigeonholed as a T20 or at least a white ball player. Even though he aspired to play Test match cricket, he played for Trinidad and Tobago. And his numbers were still very good. But it comes down to that lack of vision of our administrators and just simply pigeonholing someone. Now, of course, many years ago, he gave up on his aspirations to play Test match cricket because he was just not going to be taken seriously, even though he did play for Trinidad and Tobago at first-class level at every opportunity up to a point. And then he just gave it up, forget about it. That's one side of it. Now you've got Nicholas Pooran. Because of that culture of pigeonholing players, why would I even want to try to play for Trinidad and Tobago? Because I'm already classified as a white ball player, one. Two, this is where the money is. This is where the revenue is. This is where the glory is. And quite naturally, players will gravitate towards that. The paradigm has changed, gentlemen, whether we choose to accept it or not. I don't accept it because I still measure on the basis of Test match cricket. And if I were to answer your specific question, Marshall, I think if Nicholas Pooran were to be selected for the next Test match that the West Indies plays, he wouldn't get double figures. And if he does get double figures, it would be only because it was a top edge over slip and a top edge over fine leg. Because Test match cricket against a red ball with 4 slips and 2 gullies, as against white ball cricket with the field spread and boundaries brought in, it's a totally different game. My regret is that Nicholas Pooran wasn't allowed to become a latter-day Alvin Kalicharan. That is my regret, that he wasn't given that opportunity, a real opportunity. Because you're not going to expect a young player to say, well, you know, we want you to give up that $500,000 contract, that $200,000 US contract, and this other contract to come and play for the West Indies and get cussed every 5 minutes. Apart from that, Nicholas Pooran is not a leader. People may want to dance around. When you heard him comment as West Indies captain, you recognize that here was someone who, not that he didn't know the game, but he played on instinct. He played on, his skills were of such that you would respond to the immediate challenge. But he didn't come across as a thinking cricketer. His comments were inane. His comments were basically irrelevant. His comments more or less bore no relation to the cricket that we just watched. So I give him credit for stepping away from the captaincy, because you're right, it could have destroyed him. And now he's come back as an even better white ball player. Maybe he's playing with a fire in him to prove everybody wrong from that disastrous period as a captain. But again, there are some who are just not meant to lead. And Nicholas Pooran is one of them.
Well, yeah, what? I've got nothing to say. That's okay. Fazier's left me speechless, although in a good way, I should add. Santoki, listen, I'll let you wrap it.
Yeah, no, as Machel said, it's been an absolute tour de force. Fazeer, I'm not sure if you'll be in the TT Express tomorrow with headlines about cussing Brian Lara and Nicholas Pooran in the space of 90 minutes. But it's been an absolute pleasure. As Mash said, we have to get you back on to go more in depth on Brian Lara. So please tell your agent we'll be calling him very soon. Okay?
Okay, well, I'll tell my agent to be a much harder bargainer the next time. But in the end, you'll win. Because, gentlemen, I want to give you credit for having discussions like this. Not just with myself, of course, because my vanity will take over eventually. But the thing is that unless our present generation, the younger ones, really understand and appreciate those who came before and what they did, then we will never really, and then we will continue that discussion about, we should go and play separate territories. It doesn't really matter. West Indies cricket is irrelevant and so on. Only because we fail to understand. And I commend you both, Machel and Santoki, for the work that you do. And gentlemen, keep on keeping on. And my agent will have his line open waiting for your call.
Do you know what, Fazeer? I was literally about to say thank you so much, but you should never have said that last line, because give us in 2 sentences, because a lot of people have been talking about this. 50 years from now, do you still see the West Indies being a cricketing entity?
Yes, I do. I still see the West Indies being a cricket entity. Maybe not in Test cricket, which I would have never said 10, 20 years ago, because the way things are going with the game, the global game, the way we are now a minnow nation being treated when it comes to Test match cricket. But I think that there are enough people around for whom the label West Indies means something. The history behind it and what we've been able to achieve, and we are not completely dead. We're in the intensive care ward, but we're not critical as yet. So I think we'll still be around. I won't be around, but West Indies cricket will be around.
Well, just as well we got you on, because it is, as you say, I agree with you. It's conversations like these that I guess I would say help weave the kind of tapestry together. West Indies cricket didn't start in the 21st century. we have a very storied history, and unless we have these conversations, unless we kind of tell the stories from the different territories, people will forget, as you say, what we've done, where we've come from, and why it's so important to kind of maintain the institution in and of itself. So, as Santoki says, Fazeer, thank you so much for coming on. You must be one of, I think you're in a very special company of people who've come on more than once. so thank you very much for coming on, and we look forward to having you on another time in the near future.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Take care.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that has been Fazeer Mohammed. What more can we say? He's given us an absolute education on the history of Trinidad and Tobago cricket. I hope you've enjoyed that. For those of you watching this on YouTube, obviously it's gone up live. Tell your friends, tell your family. It's a must watch, share it. Those listening on the audio podcast platforms, like, share, leave a review. You know all of that. Santoki, final words to you.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure, Mash. as you said, we tried as much as we could to get as much of Trinidad and Tobago cricket history within the space of 90 minutes. So hope everyone has enjoyed it, and be on the lookout because we'll be back with another Island Nation special coming very soon with a very special guest. So as Mash said, share it around, like, comment, subscribe to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Keep the movement coming. We'll keep the content coming. Have a good morning, afternoon, good night, wherever you're listening to in the world, and we'll see you very soon. Take care, guys.
Take care.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rules seem coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.